It's okay, it takes time. I know
Welcome back to Strong. I'm so excited to bring another incredible guest. Today, we are zooming out to Ohio, where we meet with Kenneth Smith. Kenneth is an educational consultant, an author, a coach, and a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, otherwise known as the IDI. Tonight's conversation is one of probably the most important conversations I believe we need to be having with our children, with our students, with our families, with each other. It is a conversation that makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable, and we are going to be talking very candidly throughout this conversation. If you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to give us a shout and send them out. You can find us on Instagram at Strong by MV. Welcome, Kenneth. I'm so excited to have you with me tonight.
I definitely appreciate you having me. I'm excited.
It's really exciting, and I'm being very, very honest. I'm really anxious about this conversation, and I know I'm not alone. Apparently, it's very common to be feeling uncomfortable, and most often, well-intentioned people having conversations about racism and discrimination do feel uncomfortable, and that's why it's so important to have it. I really think that the more we talk about it, the more educated we become, the more connected we become in this conversation, the less uncomfortable it becomes as well. So
I agree.
let's start by introducing who you are, Kenneth. Talk to us a little bit about the work that you do and what brings you here tonight.
Well, I am a lifelong learner. I just finished my 15th year in education. And so I've held many roles. I started out as a substitute teacher, and then I worked part-time as a bullying prevention specialist. Went back and got my master's degree in special education to become a behavioral intervention specialist, specifically self-contained students who were diagnosed with emotional disturbance. And so they were considered the bad kids, if you wanted to, give them a name. And so I did that, and I did that for 9 years. It was amazing, a lot of fun. The people that I worked with were amazing, and we were actually able to increase that graduation rate for those students by 25% over the 9 years that we were there. And so, because those students weren't graduating. After that, though, I then went into a different role for 3 years. In terms of the name of that role was the restorative practices coordinator. And I was still at my alma mater, actually, here in Akron, Ohio, booked CLC. And in that role, so what was happening was I made a lot of connections with kids, and I knew families, and I'm in my neighborhood that I grew up in. But discipline, the statistics are so disproportionate in terms of who's getting disciplined and all of these different things. And so restorative practices just allows the teaching element of discipline, right? Because if you don't teach through it, then you're probably going to just see the same mistakes over and over again. So we were able to do that and actually reduce suspension rates. And the goal was to actually help teachers understand discipline differently. And so getting out of the punishing all the time, right? Because if they're not learning, then they're just going to repeat the same mistakes. So I was doing that. Over the course of those 3 years, I took a training to become a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI assessment, which measures intercultural competence. And it's been amazing because a colleague and I created Disruptor University. So I know you'll get to talk to Erica, Dr. Glover, soon, but she got her PhD in urban education, and specifically talking about the experiences that Black teachers had to navigate through as students, and the things that made us successful as teachers. And so we're just kind of blending it all together and trying to figure out how we can, talk about our experiences so that multiple cultures in school settings are valued and brought to the forefront of education.
Amazing. That's amazing work. What are you taking away from the experiences that you have every time you talk to students? Because you described yourself a lifelong learner. And I think as educators, Students think that we're supposed to have all the answers, but as educators, we know that we're always learning. And with every new group of students, we learn something new, or we learn how to do something different and maybe even better. So, what do
Mm.
you take away from the experiences that you have when you're working with your students?
Honestly, the thing that I take away from it is learning with them, right? Because unfortunately, in my opinion, people get caught up into labels and titles. And so I have my master's and I have a master's degree or I have a doctorate degree. But when students come into your presence, they're experts of their own experiences. And so when you really allow students to be experts of their experiences and to learn with them, that's my largest takeaway of just being an educator. And I'll give one small example. Last year, or before COVID, it was before COVID year, I was teaching our high school students how to run restorative circles. And I had a young lady who was Hispanic background, and I talked about my experience as a Black male and how my experience wasn't included in education. And then she was able to actually take what I was saying and tell me about her experience as a Latina young lady and how she wasn't included in education, how she felt excluded. And so that enabled me to learn a lot. And just those experiences, allowing people to have a voice, young people to have a voice is very powerful.
I love that. I really, really love that. I'm going to pick up on just that. You talked about recognizing oneself in education, in curriculum. How important is this from your experience? And why is this important? Why is this something that parents and educators need to pay more attention to?
Just as you're trying to identify who you are as an individual, it's important that you see yourselves represented in things that you wish and aspire to be. And so when I take that into practice, like literally my very first year, I taught in an alternative school in our district that was the most severe behavioral students that the district had, right? And so before going in, they told me that my classroom, every student in my classroom was multiple grade levels behind on reading. And so I'm like, okay, like that's something that we can work on and try to figure out how we're going to, change those statistics, right? And so we had a program at the time, it was called 100 Book Challenge. And so it was leveled. So every grade level, for example, first grade will be purple and second grade will be green or whatever, and all the way up. And so we had this program, and I have 11 African American males in my class. Well, actually 10. I had 10 African American males and one white male, right? And so as I'm going through these bins of 100 Book Challenge and I'm looking at the literature that was in there, I'm like, well, they may not be able to read on grade level, but the information that they're asking them to read doesn't look very appealing. And so what I did was, with my first year teacher stipend, was I bought a set of books about the three doctors we beat the streets. And it was just about three African American male doctors who experienced school and a lot of hardships and just overcoming life. And so I bought those books because I figured that my students could relate to it. And it was amazing because it went from them being labeled as struggling readers to them asking me, can we read in the morning and in the afternoon, because they got so engaged in the book. And so, of course, there were episodes of them struggling and things of that nature, navigating through some of the reading, but they actually wanted to read. And so now you can actually work on the deficits that they had. And they felt like they were a part, they could connect to the story that was being told. And so that's a big deal. Like being able to see yourself as what you're reading is very important. And we have data that supports that.
So I'm going to pick up on something. You were talking about representing oneself and making sure that young people see themselves in the work that they're doing. But there was one child in your class. How did you approach that one child that couldn't see himself? Because I think this is a thing, as teachers around the world will be saying, well, there are so many children in my class, and with the world the way it is, there's so much diversity.
Right.
Everyone is a little bit of somebody different, right? So how do we cater to everybody's needs in the classroom? How did you approach it?
So here's how I approach that. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because An administrator, one of our assistant principals at the time, came in and saw that the what we were reading, and that young man, and he felt like he wasn't represented because it was three African American males. The book was about African American males, but the other part, so it doesn't have to be only race, right? And so we have to make sure that we don't limit our perspectives to race. So this young man, the people who were in our class were free and reduced lunch, living in extreme poverty, right? Realistically. So the young white male that was in the class, he was able to connect to the struggle that the three doctors were living with. So he couldn't connect to them from a racial perspective because it was three black males in the book who were the main characters of the reading. But he was able to connect to the struggle and things that they went through. And so we were able to talk about that and how they saw themselves through that story. And so you have situations like that where it's not always a racial identity, although that's part of it, but there's other areas. So now once you get buy-in and they feel like they're connected to the story or the plot or whatever it is that you're trying to do, math, you can find different ways to make a connection to them realistically. Once you make that connection, now you have buy-in, and all students are looking for is to connect with something. And once you connect with something, then everyone learns differently, and they're able to actually learn, though. So that's what I did specifically with that individual. And then so I actually wrote down another book. So I did summer school one summer for struggling readers. And it was not at the same building, but we read a book called Among the Hidden, right? And so in that book, it talked about the government limiting families to 2 kids per family. And it talked about, you know, some of the governmental control of population control, right? And so initially looking at the cover, this was the majority African American students. Like they really weren't interested in reading about like Among the Hidden when they looked at the cover. But once we talked about the story, and some of them, a lot of them came from larger families that had multiple siblings, and would have the government said that it was only allowed to be you and one of your other siblings, like how would you determine who's the other sibling that gets to stay alive, right? So we had conversations about what that. So then again, a connection. So now I'm connected to it in some way. It didn't have to be limited to only race, but we were connected to it. And then once they made that connection, it made them more interested. And so that book turned out to be amazing. Because even myself, honestly, like looking at the cover, I didn't think it was going to be interesting for them. And it was amazing. So you just have to be open to learning.
That is really, really amazing. So I want to read something from a literature by Thangaraj. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, who wrote an article called Racing the Muslim Strategies for Teaching. And in his literature, he talks about curriculum specifically and how educators really need to be looking at what they're teaching and focusing in on making sure that the students in the room can recognize themselves, as you said, and also remembering the importance of introducing the curriculum that makes sure that every student in the room is not only seeing themselves, but also understanding their positionality and understanding who's teaching in that room and the positionality. And he really talks deeply about culture and bias and what we're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking, as an educator myself, and I'm so consciously aware of how socially constructed racism and discrimination is and how subtle it is and what we're being taught and what we're being fed. So putting into context my positionality, you know, I am the child of immigrant parents, half one European immigrant family and half of another. I never felt like I fit in. My parents moved to Canada hoping that life could be better for their children, you know, in the late 60s. Very common story that you hear from many European families who migrated to Canada and the US. I never felt like I belonged. I was always so, and this is something I want to talk a little bit about. So I apologize for the rambling, but I remember thinking I'm different. I don't think I had the capacity to see anybody else as different because
Hmm.
I was so focused on how I was different. And then now, all these years later, and learning, finally learning about what we're teaching and how we're teaching, and learning about my own positionality, I'm thinking, is it that young people are so concerned about fitting in, that they're so concerned about being different, that they don't have the capacity to recognize what it's like to fit in somebody else's shoes? Like you were saying with your one student in the class, that reading, he could start to recognize and understand the challenge. But do you think that young people have that in them to do that? Or is it that it's something that has to be taught as part of the curriculum? Like we literally have to be sitting children down and talking about this and teaching this to them, because naturally they're just really into themselves. That's just what it's like to be young and a
Hmm.
teenager. Or am I just talking from my positionality, and you're like, no, Maria, that's not really what it's like?
Well, I don't think it's limited to one perspective, though, right? And so I think there'll be a lot of students out there who have the same perspective that you have, but then you'll have a lot of students who have different perspectives. For example, myself, it also depends on like where the home you come from and the exposure that you have to different things. So fortunate for me, I was able to be exposed to a lot of different cultures through sports. So I was able to kind of look at different lenses because I wasn't limited to. Now I grew up in a neighborhood that was all black. I went to a school that was all black, right? But I played multiple sports that had other cultures around, and in doing that, it allowed me to see more than just the neighborhood that I was in. Now, some people are restricted too. So you have students who are in extreme poverty who never are able to leave the environment that they're a part of, and they only see one thing. So I don't think that there's just one specific answer to that. But the key is, in my opinion, is that's where, as a teacher, you have an opportunity to build a community. So like our classroom was a community. It was a family. Like it really literally was a family. And it in establishing that family, people felt more comfortable, and they didn't really have to worry about as much um, fitting in everyone individually, because we made it a point to embrace everyone. And so those things can happen by having conversations. You can have small surveys. You can find out things that people like. You can do icebreakers. But in my opinion, what happens in education is people do these things like the first week or two of school, right? And so now you think that you've built a community. That's not something that's going to happen in the first 2 weeks of school only. It has to be continuous and ongoing. And then you have to be able to take multiple cultures and perspectives, and speak on them, and then also be willing to speak on your own experiences. So honestly, there's just so many ways. But for young people, in terms of us teaching it, I think at school we have to reinforce it. We have to reinforce. You can look at the world, right? You have the media puts out information on things that's going on in the world. We can use those as teachable moments. We can compare historic moments to things that are taking place now and find out the similarities and differences. We can look at power and privilege, right? That's a big deal, because when you start to look at power and privilege, and that's what myself and my colleague have done with Disruptor University. I was a student athlete, right? And so I'm realistic enough to say that in high school, I had a different type of power that I was able to flex, so to speak, in school that other students didn't have. Right. And so I think a lot of people who are in power, when you start to think about racism and um, structurally in racism, right, I'm not really able to admit the power that I have, because I struggle admitting that that's a power. Like I know that as an athlete, I had an extra amount of power, and I'm okay admitting that, right? And I understand that that was a place of power and privilege that I had. So when people who are in power and have privilege can actually speak to it, then you start to have different conversations, because now there's a different way of connecting, because we've all experienced, for the most part, different power and privilege, no matter what it was. And so now you can get into those uncomfortable conversations.
So let's go into an uncomfortable part of the conversation. And
Okay.
I think as an educator, if we are going to be at the front of the room and we are going to build that community, as you say, now in every family, there are uncomfortable conversations. You have to have them and you kind of get through them. They're not always easy to have. You don't always feel great having them, but I think with every conversation, that relationship deepens. So I want you to talk to an educator that may not be aware of how to have this conversation. What are some of your top tips for that educator that, you know what, grew up, never really learned about positionality, never really understood what privilege really meant because they've spent their whole life working really hard or studying really hard and really taking those assumptions for granted, that privilege for granted. The idea of meritocracy and that I've worked for it, I earned it, the American dream. Talk to that educator who really has such an important role in the classroom. And I think with the way that the world is right now, there's so many different cultures and nationalities coming together in places like Canada and the US, the UK, Australia. They're all living together, but not really understanding how to live together. Our children are in the classrooms together. Educators are not evolving fast enough. So, top tips for that type of educator.
Well, I think that like you have to, again, I spoke on this earlier in being a lifelong learner, but you have to be willing to look at like multiple perspectives and things that you did not learn in school, right? And so we can't limit here's an example: redlining, right? Redlining is something that took place here in the United States, with discrimination, specifically not allowing Black families to buy housing, right? And so when you look at the neighborhoods that we have right now and the segregation that we have here in the United States, like redlining is a huge part of that. So when you have, for example, a white teacher who earned, right? Because not saying that they didn't go to college and earn their credentials and things of that nature, but when you start to peel back the layers of being put in position of success, right? Being put in that position uh, of the structure that was in place before you were born. So if you were put in position, for example, for me and my ancestrals, if you start to break down the lineage, right, there was a point in time that my ancestors were not allowed to buy land. First, they had everything stolen from them, right, and then they were actually free labor, so they're actually building up this country, and then they never received anything for it. Versus, I'm comparing myself to a white teacher, for example, right? Their family history where they were able to inherit things based off of their lineage from stolen things that they had. So it puts them in a different position. And so it doesn't take away from the hard work that they put in to get to where they are. But what happens is we don't go back and start to look at the different effects and things that took place in our lineage that allow the system to be what it is now. So for example, if you look at America, white men were dominant and still dominate your Fortune 500 companies, your boards, things of that nature. We're starting to get, women are starting to get more opportunities. Now we're starting to diversify somewhat. But if you start to look at that, white men were looked at as the ultimate power and for a long period of time. And so that structurally trickled down, because when I'm when I'm a person in a position of power, and then I can transfer that position of power to my lineage, then it allows a structure to stay in place that breeds that. You know what I'm saying? So those are the type of things that are taking place. So as an educator, you have to continue to learn about why is it so different. If we look at segregation, how is the world more segregated now than it was then, and what took place? When you look at education, so we talk about in America the Brown versus Board of Education historic ruling that allowed integration of schools, right? And so my colleague, Dr. Glover, this was part of her dissertation research. What we never talk about is the Black teachers and Black schools that we had before integration took place. And so what happened was we eliminated all of those schools. We eliminated all of those teachers who were qualified teachers, and they told those teachers that they weren't qualified to teach white children. So you have like just different things that took place that power and privilege automatically were there, and so they were able to benefit from it, right? You start to look at mainstream media, and psychologically, you can ask people, what does a Black male look like in mainstream media in comparison to a white male, right? And so you can actually find the bias in those things. So with that structure still in place, right, those are still things that unfortunately are still having an impact. So as a teacher, you have to be open enough to continue to learn and see multiple perspectives, because that's one of the only ways that this is going to continue to tip this boat into where everyone feels like they're actually a part of the movement moving forward.
So now I'm going to talk from the perspective, picking up on where what you're just talking about. An educator who is paid to teach a curriculum that's very structured and there's no room for growth and development. You know, you've got to teach what you have to teach because there are national assessments that are coming up and the students have got to learn this curriculum. How do those teachers do it? Because they have to teach the content.
And that's where we are right now, right? We have to get around this because that is the handicapping. So when you look at like standardized testing and all of these different things, so now as a teacher, and especially where we are now, the ability to be creative. So for example, project-based learning, now you're able to actually take a project or a problem-based learning and actually allow students to have critical thinking in order to help you solve those different problems, right? So, for example, there was a test, the poll test that Black voters had to take back in the day. That was like one of my colleagues used it and had our students be exposed to it. It would say check the. It would have like multiple boxes for you to check the correct answer, right? And so let's say I went to that box and I wrote an X. It allowed for the data to be manipulated. It is where I'm going, right? Or when I give a standardized test to third grade students who live in extreme poverty, and the test questions talk about scuba diving, for example, right? So now you're giving information to these students who have not been exposed to that, right? And so those are the biased things that happen to the curriculum. We have to look at those. Right now, what teachers can do is continue to look at problems so students are able to critically think. But in terms of the biasness of the test and things of that nature, that's policy and practice that's been in place over so many years. Those are the type of things that we need to look at. Like we have the curriculum, like the same books, so I'll talk about what I wrote down. Memory laws. Memory laws are legal provisions governing the interpretation of a historical event and showcases the legislators or judicial preference for a certain narrative of the past, right? Those are called memory laws. So what's happening even right now, as we're looking to address this issue, we're only allowing one perspective to be reign true when that's not the case, right? Um, that's what's happening to the curriculum. So the advice that I would give to teachers who are struggling with that is finding ways to take what you have to teach, but then supplementing it with what you can teach and knowledge that you are able to obtain. Because if you don't do that, that's how we continue to get the same thing over and over and over that we're getting right now.
And I think you hit it when you talked about being critically reflecting and really reflexive. I think even just having that very quick conversation, you know, what are some of the biases in teaching this? I think we have to teach it, but it doesn't mean that we can't use it as the lesson itself as well. I think if we look at a plenary, for example, right at the end of a teacher's lesson, those last few minutes, you could be wrapping up, take a couple of minutes and really reflect on what we were talking about today and how this lands for you, and what are you learning about yourself. For example, do you see yourself in the learning? Can you recognize your presence in the learning? And if you don't, what perspective or what lens do you think this was coming from? I think there's always room to have curious questions, but it's how comfortable. I really do think it comes down to how visible, how aware, and how comfortable the educator is in having those conversations. I think, if an educator is not empowered by the school leader to allow them to have these conversations, they're always afraid that somebody's going to go home upset and a parent is going to call back the school. And then what do I do? Right. So how do we approach that? And I know tonight we're not going to come up with these, massively, we're not solving one of the biggest problems that needs to be solved, but we are having the needed conversation.
Definitely.
So how do we help an educator? Is it that they kind of have to be one way in the classroom and another way in their life? How do we empower them?
I think we empower them by trying to help them understand the importance of connecting what's happening in the world to what the student should be learning, right? Because now if I have a parent that is coming to me, and parents are going to come and question, right? But if a parent is coming to me to question what it is that I'm teaching their child, and I'm able to connect what I'm teaching their child with things that are happening in the world, I think that there's a different type of conversation that can be held there. And I'm not saying that the parent is going to always agree, because like you have, okay, so 3 years ago, 4 years ago, my grandmother passed away. My grandmother used to talk to myself and my siblings about her experience as a Black woman growing up in the South and going to school and getting things thrown at her and being spit at and getting mistreated by white people, right? So those experiences actually took place. Like there is no maybe, no kind of, like that was her truth, right? But so then as the world has begun to evolve and change, we were actually able to have conversations with her about the differences of our experience versus her experience. But that doesn't discredit the fact that she actually had to live that and actually had to experience that. So now, how are those type of experiences happening still today in the world, but not the same, right? So for example, you don't have white people deliberately in public as much going up to people of other races and doing things to them because it's not legal, right? And so the context of it has changed, but you still have those things and those mentalities, because that's where I was getting at. Like my grandmother had kids, those people who were doing things to her at that time, they had children too. And so these things are being learned at home. And so at the end of the day, if you're able to teach critical thinking and you're able to constantly show and explain your thought process, but then another thing I would suggest to educators is allow students to start solving these problems and giving suggestions, right? When you give them the power of actually coming up with solutions, Like that would really change our world, and that would change education because students will tell you what they think is wrong, give you possible solutions, and they will actually get behind those things and try to make them move forward. So I think it's just important that we stop trying to teach at them all the time and learn and teach with them. So then you'll start to see some real changes. But it's definitely important that, like you said, at the university level in teacher prep, right? In teacher prep, if we're not having these conversations in teacher prep, then are we really preparing our future teachers for the reality of education? And the last thing I'll say, one thing that I struggle with right now being in education and being a consultant is you have a lot of schools and school districts that talk about the global economy as their mission statement, right? The global this, global that. Well, in reality, global means diversity. Global means multiple people and multiple perspectives. And so you have all of these educational institutions that are speaking about global things, but then we're not actually seeing that practice. So you could point to the mission statement of your school when you're having a conversation with a parent, and if it says something about global, you can show the parent how you're preparing their kid to be a global citizen. So it's just you just have to understand that everyone's not going to agree, but as long as you're doing your due diligence and you understand what it is that you're doing, then you can feel more comfortable having that conversation with the parents, in my opinion.
So I'm going to put out there that I'm hearing you. I mean, it sounds great, but do you believe that some people have that permission and some people don't have that permission? And this is why this conversation is uncomfortable. In the literature, I'm trying to remember who wrote this. I think it might have been Lopez and Jean Marie, and they talked about the issues are not singular. They're systemic issues, and we can't just deal with a singular issue. We really have to look at the mechanisms of oppression. Now, that's a big thing. And I know that when you're in the classroom and, child A says something about child B, what is really happening is that they're mirroring the system. They're not child A and child B. They're representing their social construction. They're representing what exists in the world or in their society, right? So an educator at the front of the room, if they haven't been taught to recognize that, this is not child A and child B, this is bigger. This is a learning moment. Rather than punishing one child for being rude to the other, let's use this as that moment. Now, it sounds seamless as we talk about it. We've both been in the classroom. We both know how challenging it is. However, do you believe, and I know that this is coming from your perspective, and this is not all perspectives, this is a conversation between two people with so many people in the room who aren't physically in the room, but we do have to start somewhere. Do you believe that some people are allowed to have these conversations and some people, they need to ask permission to have the conversation? So, for example, in this conversation, you mentioned black and white a lot. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, am I allowed to use those adjectives, or is it only one person that's allowed to use those adjectives? So if I'm at the front of,
feel like that.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about it, right? So if I'm at the front of the classroom, what am I allowed to say? Who tells me that's allowed? Who decides what's allowed and what isn't allowed? So from your perspective, what would you say as an educational consultant to, I'm assuming that you would describe, how would you describe me, Kenneth? If you saw me in the street, what would I be described as?
A white female.
Okay, so when hearing you say, whenever I hear that, I don't think of me as a white female.
Correct.
I don't think of me. I've never, what comes to my mind when I hear white female, blonde hair, blue eyes, and really white skin. And that's not me. I don't recognize that. But from the outside, and in the TED Talk by Garza, Colors, and Tometi, they talked about the spectrum from one end of the spectrum to the other. And they talked about it being closer to one. So I would be closer to white than I would the other end of the spectrum. But if you were to say, Maria, you're white, I would be like, no, I'm not. I don't see
Right.
that. So what would I be allowed to say to my students, and who gives me permission? I think this is why these conversations are so hard to have.
I know, and they are important because you do wonder. So for me personally, I always looked at it from a lens of doing right by the kids. And so when I say that is, I never worried about the higher ups like questioning what I did, because everything that we did and we talked about, I would connect it to the learning standards, right? And so at the end of the day, like I'm still doing the job that was being asked of me in terms of the learning standards. For example, when we read in high school the autobiography of Malcolm X with my class, that wasn't a reading that was a part of the curriculum. But if I'm able to take the language arts standards and infuse those standards into what I'm doing, I'm still meeting the curriculum while using other type of literature to get the point across. So you have to be, so it was going to take like some extra work and some extra preparation and things of that nature, but it allows you to then be able to do these things. So I guess really what I'm saying is, if you're going to step outside the box, make sure that you're still doing what is being asked of you, right? That was my approach, and that was how I looked at it. And so you can always connect information to standards, and so then those are things that can be measurable, and then you can show growth. And so now you're actually in the educational profession, and you're showing what it is that you can do, along with exposing people to some culture that maybe they may not have been exposed to. I mean, you still have educational institutions still using the same literature. I've been out of high school for 21 years. You have educational institutions using the same books and literature that when I was in school, right? And so you have to be willing as a teacher. Now, this isn't in teacher prep. So teacher prep isn't going to tell you to step outside of the box, right? So you have to make an educated decision as an educator to, one, how are you going to make your students lifelong learners? And then two, how are you going to do what you need to do to keep your job? So it is that like slippery slope, because people are like, well, I don't want to lose my job, right? By teaching something that they say I'm not allowed to teach, and people are getting fired for different things. But me personally, that's when my personal preference and things come into play, where like, I know I'm doing what's right for kids. I know that I'm connecting it to the standards and they're really learning. And at the end of the day, I could live with that. And so that was a personal decision by me that some people may not be as comfortable making. So it's not one answer to that. That's a slippery slope.
Definitely not one answer to that. So I'm just so conscious of our time, and it's such an important conversation. Just as we're wrapping it up, part one, I think I'd love for this to keep going and bringing lots of other members onto this panel and talking a little more about it. I know that I'm still not comfortable with this conversation. I don't know what it is about the conversation that makes me uncomfortable. And I think it's because I've never had to speak about it. And it's only come to my consciousness because I'm taking a class currently on diversity and positionality and racism and discrimination, and looking at all things from people of color to religion and spirituality and sexual orientation. And there's so many elements of racism and discrimination. And I'm very much in the learner's seat. But I think what is different for me this time as a learner than any other time as a learner is I'm scared to make a mistake. And I know in some of the literature, they talk about well-intentioned people that think they're doing right, but actually it's making it worse. And it's because nobody ever, it's like a conversation that it's the elephant in the room that I think white people have had that we've never had to talk about. We've never been allowed to, it's never been a conversation. And now,
Right.
with everything that's going on in the world, it is a conversation, and it should be a conversation. And, our children are awakened. They are educating their parents on topics like this. I hear it, I hear it through friends and my own children saying, Mama, you can't say that. That's not allowed. And I'm like, that's amazing that but who taught you that?
Yeah.
Because nobody ever taught me this. And the answer I keep getting from children is, you're supposed to know that. And I think, for young children, it's wonderful that they're so consciously aware, and
Mhm.
somewhere along the way, and I wonder if it's social media, I wonder if it's because access is a lot easier to stories of people around the world, but at the same time, the children aren't the educators at the front of the room. It's the adults who are really stuck in their old ways by choice, maybe by unconscious, they're not consciously aware, but it has to change, right? So, in doing that, I think we need to start really teaching. And I apologize to anyone listening if this sounds really silly or if it's disrespectful, but if somebody like me who is always trying to learn more and do better, and I'm still concerned that I'm not able to comfortably have a conversation like this, how are we helping anybody in our circles? Are we doing more harm than good? So, bringing it to a close for today, Kenneth, just give me some of the taboo things that you think you've heard and think, oh, please, anybody listening, this really has a bigger impact than you're aware of.
Um, I think that, like, okay, I'll speak from an experience. One of the things that really bothered me in my journey as a teacher, and it was like, because students come from extreme situations that they may be dealing with, that totally took away their ability to learn, right? And so what happens is you start to view that student as not a person, right? Because you start to feel sorry for them, and because of the situation that they're going through. And so now, by feeling sorry for them, you don't actually prepare them. And so that's where it's that slippery slope, because I've seen educators struggle to balance that, right? Because for me, right, I'm going to love you first, right? I'm going to love you first because it all starts with that. But then at the same time, I'm going to hold you accountable as well. And so I think that that's one of the things, people coming into the inner city and thinking that they're going to save all the little black kids or the poor kids. It's not even just now you're talking about socioeconomically, right? All of the poor kids and things of that nature. Um, so I think that you have to be careful. And well, let me classify it maybe better like this. Every black male didn't live I'm from the hood and my life has been terrible, right? Like, so if you start to put us in categories of that, and then you might start talking to me, right? Because you think all black males live this certain life, and we don't, right? So it's very important. That's one of the things that happens, right? We start to plug people into these roles that we think everyone lives, and we're not living that. And so then that's when you start to make the situation worse, because you're not even realizing that you're classifying people in specific roles that they may not have even lived or been a part of. So So that's one thing right there that I would say in education, like stop placing everyone in the same role because of the color of their skin or things of that nature.
That's a big one. Thank you so much, Kenneth. Well, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. So much more to talk about. I feel like we didn't even scratch the surface.
Right.
I'm still, I'll be honest with you, I'm walking away thinking, I still don't think I understand how to have these conversations. So I'm going to keep having these conversations until.
So you do understand, because that's the answer. You just have to keep on learning with, like we're learning together. Like I'm learning with you and listening to you and your experience. Like what I'm taking away from you and your experience is that like you never felt included. You never felt included, right? And so how many other children out there are going through school right now and are not just limited to the black and white? Because when we get into race, we always put it in that category. How many students out there feel like you? And how can we help educators so we don't have multiple students feeling like you? That is the work that myself and Dr. Glover are so invested in, because you shouldn't have to go through school feeling like you felt. No one should.
I agree with you, but in hearing you say it, I think, who am I to complain? Right? There's people struggling even more. Like my struggle is nothing compared to the struggles that I'm seeing. And I think this is it, is like, I think, and you touched on it before, one person's struggle doesn't make another one's irrelevant. And I think it's meeting and understanding and empathizing, not sympathizing. We shouldn't have, I feel sorry for you. It really should be, what's that like for you? And help me to understand what that's like for you.
Definitely.
And that's why we're having this conversation tonight. It's because I want to understand, and I know that if I don't understand, that I'm not the only one, because I'm an example. I'm mirroring my system. I'm mirroring the systemic construction of what we're supposed to be identifying with. And we have to keep having this conversation. So thank you for
Definitely.
joining me here tonight,
Thank
Kenneth.
you for having me. I'm excited for us moving forward.
Definitely. And that brings us to the end of probably one of the most important conversations. And I know on #strong, it's hard to say that because every conversation is so important, but this is a conversation I really believe we need to be having more of in the classroom. And I think, Kenneth, correct me if I'm wrong, but a conversation like this, and it doesn't matter the color of your skin, where you come from, what faith you believe in, this is where educators and students are all learning at the same time. We're learning
Definitely.
from each other's experience. And I think when an educator can come from that and say, hey, everyone, I'm Maria, and I've never had a group of students just like you. So let's learn together. And there's going to be things that I know, and there are going to be things that I get wrong, I'm not skilled at doing, and I need your help. But it's bringing out the ego, would you say? And I think,
Definitely.
I think as well, when we're introducing ourselves to parents for the first time, coming from that place, bringing down the ego, allowing parents to feel that it is an approachable conversation, regardless whether we're talking about numeracy or literacy or computer science or whatever we're talking about, bringing down the ego and saying, this is what the curriculum says we have to teach. These are some of the challenges we're facing. This is how I see us approaching it. What would you like me to know that I haven't already mentioned today? And I think
that's another thing. Wait till you talk to Erica. You're going to love it. That's another thing that we talk about, like include the parent, like including the community, right? Including the community, because every community has different needs, has different things, areas of interest, right? And so when you include the community in that conversation, you even can learn with the community, right? And so we can get out of these silos of these limit. Why are we limiting our learning? Like, it really doesn't make sense when you think about it. And so if we could bring the community in, and now they feel like their kids are getting something and they can get something, oh my goodness, that's going to be the true education. That's the education of the future, when everyone is just learning together.
I hope we get to see that in our lifetime.
Definitely.
Okay, everybody. I said it was the end of our conversation before, and we just jumped back into another one. I will bring it to a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Kenneth, for joining me. And I will see you all next week when we bring another incredible conversation to Strong.
All right. Thanks. Have a good day.